My first guest was just 20 years old and an exchange student in Italy when she was wrongfully accused of murdering her flatmate, Meredith Kercher, and sentenced to life in prison. She spent 4 years in jail before the Italian Supreme Court quashed her conviction, fully exonerating her in 2015. Her new book is called Free, and she's here tonight to tell us why she is finally able to reclaim her life and feel that freedom. Would you please welcome to the Late Late Show, Amanda Knox. Amanda, your story is a story that a lot of people think they know, but reading this book, they don't know at all. I'm assuming this is one of the reasons why you decided to write this.
Well, I wrote it because I think in a big way, everything that people think about when they think about my story is not really my story at all. It's a story of things that other people did to me and that I just happened to live through. And I think that's actually true of a lot of wrongful conviction cases or even just stories of trauma. It's just a thing that comes at a person, hits them like a train, and they have to survive it for a while. And then afterwards, it's when their story really begins, because that's when they have to ask themselves, oh my God, who am I? What does this mean? Am I defined by this worst experience of my life forever? And I experienced that in a big way because I went from being just an anonymous college student to one of the most vilified women on the planet. And then, you know, even afterwards, I was the girl accused of murder forever, you know, having to prove my innocence even after I was exonerated.
For those who aren't maybe familiar with the details, can you give us a little bit of a recap of your case?
Yes, so in a nutshell, because it was a long ordeal, it was 8 years of trial. I was studying abroad in Perugia, Italy. So was Meredith Kercher, my roommate, who I met when I arrived there. We were living in this beautiful villa, beautiful country, having the time of our lives until a young man broke into our home, and Meredith happened to be home alone, and he raped and murdered her. And then I came home to discover the crime scene. I called the police, and the police believed that it wasn't actually a break-in, it was staged, and they believed that I was involved in the crime. And so they accused me, they accused my boyfriend, who was my alibi, and when forensic evidence actually came in showing that it was actually a burglar, a known burglar, instead of admitting that they were wrong, they constructed this insane narrative about a death orgy orchestrated by me and pursued this case against me for many years. And of course, it blew up in the world's imagination because it was really pornographic in nature. I think it was the idea that was being packaged by the prosecution and the media was this idea that women are incapable of true friendship, that we are constantly in sexual competition with each other, and really framing me and my roommate as opposite sides of a dichotomy about women, the whore and the virgin. And it went out of control. I think looking back on it now, today, I think everyone goes, wow, that was insane. There was no evidence of that. But at the time, I think it really spoke to people's imaginations, and it went on. I had to go over 4 years in prison until DNA evidence exonerated me. But even after that, they pursued me for trying to get me to come back in prison. A lot of it, again, based upon this idea that I didn't act like an innocent person, and just really just sort of putting me and my personality and every quirk under the microscope, looking for signs of guilt that weren't there.
So you were convicted. Your conviction then was quashed. You were released when you were in America. You were then convicted again in a retrial in your absence, and then finally the Italian Supreme Court in 2015 said that it was a mistake and you were completely innocent. I want to take you back to being 20 years of age and being put into jail for something you didn't do. What were those early days like in jail? How tough was that?
It was tough. I mean, I talk in my book about how I was the famous one, and I was also a foreigner. But it was very clear from the beginning that there was also a sexualization that was happening to me. So I was sexually harassed by guards. I was brutally abused by the police during my interrogation. And I really was in a state of frantic confusion because also I didn't speak the language. And so I had been interrogated in a foreign language. I was immersed in a world inside the prison where nobody spoke English, and I was in isolation anyway. And so it really was many, many months before I really realized like why I was there, what was happening to me. I kept thinking, oh, this is just a big mistake, and they're gonna realize that it's a big mistake. And I was in a state of denial for a long time.
Was there ever a point when you were in jail where you thought, I'm not gonna get through this?
Well, there was a shift. I would say my first 2 years in prison, my family and I talked about this, about how it seemed like we were just in a dark tunnel and there was a light at the end of the tunnel. But then once I was convicted and I was sentenced to 26 years in prison, as a 20-year-old kid, I had this epiphany. I write about it, about how suddenly I realized, oh my God, I'm not just a lost tourist sort of living someone else's life by mistake, waiting to get my life back. This is my life. And it's sad and it's unfair. And I really genuinely asked myself, is it worth living? I write about how I very vividly imagined killing myself in prison because I wasn't sure if this life was worth living. And I ultimately obviously decided not to, but I think in a weird way, and I'm sorry for trigger warning or any of this, but in a weird way, imagining my own death so vividly really put it back on me, the responsibility to make my life worth living, to get up every morning and decide I'm going to do something today that matters to me and that shows that my life matters. And so it would be something as simple as writing a letter to my mom or doing a bunch of sit-ups. But I write in the book, there's a chapter called Ikigai, where I went to Perugia because I wanted to become a translator. And after a year in prison, I became fluent in Italian. And because I can read and write, I suddenly found myself with a job in prison. I was the unofficial translator for all of these foreigners who were in the prison with me who couldn't read or write. So I was reading their letters for them. I was doing their correspondence. And I weirdly had a purpose, even in that very limited space. And interestingly enough, I was able to find a sense of purpose in prison easier than when I got out of prison and I was free.
I wanted to talk to you about that because the person who committed the murder, Rudy Guaida, was convicted. Your conviction was quashed. Mm-hmm. You were released back home to America, mm-hmm. which for a lot of people would be freedom, but for you, it really wasn't. Why was that?
Well, two reasons. One was because it was such a public story that I was being pursued constantly. As soon as I got home, helicopters were chasing me home, and for months and months and months, I was being literally stalked by paparazzi wherever I went. And so I lived in a constant state of paranoia and isolation. And I didn't feel like I could meet people. I couldn't trust people. I only talked to the people who I knew before Italy. But then on top of that, I had dreamed in prison of just going back to my life that I had before Italy. And
that was never going to
And it didn't exist anymore, not just from these external sources, but also because I had been through something. And I couldn't just pretend that 4 years of my life had not just been spent in prison. I grew up in Italy.
There was also the perception of who you were. There was the perception that was put out there that you were some type of sex-crazed femme fatale, and yes. Foxy Knoxy, which was your childhood nickname while you were playing soccer.
Yes, I'd love to know if any of the soccer guys later have funny nicknames.
Yeah.
But yes, it was a cheeky nickname that 12-year-old girls were giving each other.
But that was then put on you and given a sexual connotation, yes. which completely framed you in a different way.
Exactly. I think that, again, taking a very young girl's life and turning her every quirk and in putting it in the most sinister light, again, I was 20. I was very ignorant about the world of misogyny and the narratives that were out there about women. And I was shocked by the just utter, I think one thing that is an interesting saving grace, though, is very early on, I understood that this image of me that was out there in the world didn't correspond with me. It wasn't me. It was an idea of a person that existed in other people's minds. And so when they convicted me, for instance, they didn't convict me, they convicted a fiction. And that was the fiction that I was constantly in conversation with every time I walked out of my door when I got home. I didn't know what people thought of me. You know, to this day, someone will stop me in the street and be like, Amanda, and I'll say, do I know you? And they're like, I know you. And then I think in my head, well, what do you think you know? Because I have no idea what headlines you've read. I have no idea what misinformation you might have been privy to. And I also don't know what in your brain you are thinking about when you think of the girl accused of murder. And so I do find that I'm constantly in conversation with this fictionalized version of me.
Whenever your conviction was quashed by the Italian Supreme Court, a lot of people would just say, that's it, I'm never going back. You did something very different. Your family weren't very keen on this, but no. You decided to go to Italy and meet the prosecutor.
Yes.
Why did you do that?
Yeah, so there are these dual threads in my book of my relationship with my mom primarily. I mean, my whole entire family came behind my back, but my mom has always been so incredibly supportive of me. She was the one who encouraged me to study abroad. And then ultimately, when I decided that I wanted to go back to Italy to confront my prosecutor, she was very much against it. She did not trust him. She did not think that it was safe. But ultimately, she did the very motherly thing of saying, fine, Amanda, you're going to do what you're going to do, but there's no way in hell I'm going to let you go to Italy without me ever again. So she came along with me. But I originally reached out to my prosecutor because I did not want to be afraid of this boogeyman version of him in my mind, this idea of a person who just didn't care that I was innocent and just threw an innocent girl in prison.
And this guy here.
This man here, yes, Giuliano, as I've affectionately come to know him, or il mio procuratore. And
so whenever you met him, the Supreme Court, the ruling was that there was no evidence.
Exactly. This was after I had been definitively ruled innocent, all of that.
So did he apologize?
Well, I don't want to give away everything this evening, but what I will say is that, first of all, before I even met with him in person, I had 2 years of correspondence because I wrote to him right before the pandemic hit. So I don't know what you were doing during the pandemic. I was corresponding with my prosecutor. And what I think was most interesting was my approach was not to be confrontational. I thought that we had encountered each other in this very adversarial system, and that if I approached him in an adversarial way, he would just shut down and become defensive all over again, and would sort of resist any kind of notion of there being any kind of common ground or even common set of facts that we could agree on. And so instead, I approached him by thinking to myself, well, what do we have in common? This case has blown up in the media. I've been misrepresented as a monster, but I bet he feels misrepresented too. And so when I reached out to him, I said to him, look, Giuliano, actually at this time I was referring to him as Dottor Mignini, very respectfully, I think that I don't know who you are, and you are a person who has had a tremendous impact in my life, and I want to know who you really are. I want to know why you did what you did to me, and I do not think that you did it because you're evil or you had bad intentions.
Did he still believe the version that he had in his head, or were you able to come to some type of common ground?
So, yes, we were able to come to some common ground. What he is willing to say publicly, and for the record, I let him read everything in this book before it got published, and he accepted all the things. And he'll say things like, we disagree about a lot of the facts about the case, but what I can admit to is that you are not the person that I thought I was prosecuting, and that I could have been wrong about some things, which is huge considering in the world of prosecutors, getting a prosecutor to admit I could have been wrong about some things is tremendous. And it honestly came as a result of us having conversations, not just about the case, but also about each other, about our families, about our interests, about our lives. And I often found that I learned more about what he thought about the case when he wasn't talking about the case, because he almost feels like he, as a representative, as a prosecutor, represents the Italian justice system and has to defend it by default. But when he's talking about a movie that he wants me to see, about a detective who realizes that he put someone innocent in prison, I can't help but wonder, what are you trying to say there, Giuliano?
Yeah. I mean, the heart of all this is still Meredith Kercher. I know that you also tried to reach out to her family.
Yes.
What did they say?
Well, I've never been able to get a direct communication with them. I've reached out to their lawyer, I've reached out through a journalist that I know is in touch with them, and I've never gotten a response back. And I've resisted pushing because though it is not my fault and I had nothing to do with Meredith's murder, I know that they associate me with that huge trauma in their life. And as someone who is now very trauma-informed, I know that I don't want to force them to confront their deepest trauma just to have a relationship with me. And of course I want to have a relationship with them, and of course I want to mourn Meredith and the lives that we could have had with them. And I want to go and visit her grave, but I also understand that Meredith belongs to them before she belongs to me. And it was a very different equation when I reached out to my prosecutor because he's the one who harmed me. So I felt no qualms about pushing him to have a conversation with me because it was in my right.
So you can understand why they wanted not to communicate?
Yeah, I understand that. And it pains me. I honestly hope that they read my book because I think that we have way more in common than they might think. And I do believe that their grievance, their ongoing grievance, is one that I share, which is the truth about what happened to Meredith got lost in all of the scandal. And that's why, to this day, people don't know anything about Rudy Gaudet. They don't know that he's on trial again for having sexually assaulted another young woman since he got out of prison, because there's never been a true interest in what happened to her from this man. The only interest was in this idea of a man's crime committed by a woman.
One of the things in this book which I find extraordinary was your friendship with Monica Lewinsky. Tell us how you met her and how she helped you on this journey.
Yeah, so this was very early on, right after the Netflix documentary came out. I was invited to do my first ever speaking event, which was terrifying for me because like being in a room full of people that was my worst nightmare. I was constantly being judged. I was constantly being told to just shut up and disappear. And so to be invited to tell my story was both very exciting, but very scary. And she was also speaking at this exact same conference. And she invited me to come and meet with her, have a cup of tea. And it really just in that moment crystallized for me that, one, I was not alone, that there are other women in this world who have been shamed and vilified and pitted against other women and reduced to their, worst mistakes or worst moments. But she had gone forward. She had created a path for herself. She was now a voice to help others, sharing her story in a form of advocacy. And it really gave me a sense of purpose and a sense of, encouragement. I mean, to this day, I just talked to her an hour ago, and she's very crystally. So she was asking me to imagine myself bathed in golden light as I'm talking to you today, just so to remind me that I have value and that I have something magical and special to share with others.
You're talking about having value. It's 18 years since you were put in prison. You now are married. You're now a mom to 2 young kids.
Yeah.
You're talking about being an advocate. The book's called Free. Do you feel free?
I do. And you know what? It's not because I've been totally vindicated and freed. Just earlier this year, I was reconvicted of a lesser crime. So my journeys in Italy are not over. But I think that the main point...
That was a slander case?
Yes.
So you named someone under duress in the confession.
Yes.
And because you did that, they were then slandered.
Yes, they found me guilty of criminal slander, and they say that I knowingly and willingly accused a person that I knew to be innocent, which is bollocks. Sorry, I don't know if I'm allowed to say that. Someone else said it earlier, and I took it in my mind.
Okay.
But it's,
How does it feel, though, to have that still there on the record?
Well, you know what? It goes to that show that, the things that happen to us in life, some things are out of our control, and we have to accept life for what it is. That doesn't mean that we have to tolerate injustice. That doesn't mean I'm just going to sit around and not fight to prove my innocence in this case. But I'm also totally at peace with myself and my life and my role. I'm very grateful for everything that I have, meeting other wrongly convicted people. I was in prison for 4 years. I've met people who were in prison for 40. more than I've been alive. And so for me to be alive today, to have the opportunity to have a family, like when I was given a 26-year sentence, the biggest thing that I grieved was that I wouldn't get to be a mother. And so now to be able to be a mother of 2 beautiful children, like I am so grateful and I'm so free, and I feel like I can actually be an effective agent in my life. And I'm not just defined by the worst thing that's ever happened to me, I'm informed by it. I went to the Università of Hard Knocks, and I'm here to tell my tale.
Well, look, we are delighted to have you, and thank you so much for sharing your tale. Amanda's book, Free, My Search for Meaning, is available in shops right now. Give it up for Amanda Knox. Thank you so much. Thank you.